Hello, and thank you for watching this Hatfield Museum and History Society Community Program presentation titled Exploring Orvilla. I'm Larry Stevens, President of the Society, and it's a pleasure for us to have Donald Lewis to present this program for us, which is based on his recently self-published book, Orvilla, My Orvilla. Don grew up in the Hatfield Township village of Orvilla and attended E.B. Laudenschlager Elementary School and went on to graduate from North Penn High School in 1965. He went on to study law and then practiced law in the Philadelphia area for over 40 years before retiring. Since retiring, Don has devoted much of his time to researching and writing about local history. In fact, he has had 9 articles based on his various research projects published in the Historical Society of Montgomery County's annual journal, The Bulletin. And I can always count on Don to help me out if I run into a brick wall on something that I am researching. One of Don's great passions is for having the history of Orvilla Village, the place of his youth, preserved. So again, it's a pleasure to welcome Don Lewis to present Exploring Orvilla. Don?
Thank you, Larry, and good evening. Tonight I would like to take you all on a journey of exploration through Orvilla, a quiet and unpretentious Hatfield Township community endowed with interesting architecture and a colorful past. Our tour will take us along Orvilla Road from Welsh Road to the Cowpath with selected stops along Orvilla byways. All the land in today's Orvilla passed from Native Americans to Pennsylvania proprietor William Penn and then to a number of purchasers of tracts of land. One tract purchaser was Welshman Richard Williams, who in 1732 acquired 150 acres in the northwestern part of what 10 years later would become Hatfield Township. At the time, the area had no name, and it still had none by this 1877 county map. Most of Richard Williams' land was acquired by German-born Henry Fry. Fry donated a portion to a group of Mennonites, who in 1764 established a meeting house where today's Orvilla Road and Welsh Road intersect. Today's meeting house began as a log structure located in the church's present burial ground, and it was used both as a place of worship and as a school. The first burial in the cemetery is thought to have occurred in 1765. The church became known as the Plains Mennonite Church because it was situated on der Blen, German for the plain, a flat, sparsely wooded expanse. The log meeting house stood until 1813, when it was torn down and a stone meeting house erected in its place. In 1867, a third meeting house was erected, but it was relocated to the site where the present meeting house stands. The building has since been remodeled several times to serve the needs of the local Mennonite community. For many years, the lands along today's Orvilla Road remained sparsely populated and agricultural. They and Hatfield Township remained part of Philadelphia County until Montgomery County was formed in 1784. In November 1725, John Wright purchased 282 acres of unimproved land, bordered by today's Welsh Road, Orvilla Road, Schwab Road, and Squirrel Lane, and encompassing much of today's Orvilla. Wright's tract included a 4-room log cabin built in 1719. This home, at 1283 Colonial Drive, began its life as that cabin and is thought to be the oldest existing residential structure in Hatfield Township. For many years it stood in more isolated surroundings, and at one time it appeared like this. John Wright was a Quaker of English descent. Quakers opposed bearing arms or joining insurrections, and during America's Revolution, Wright and his three sons, John Jr., Jonathan, and Abijah, remained loyal to the British Crown. None joined local militia companies, and Abijah registered as one of Hatfield Township's non-associators, citizens opposed to bearing arms. Before his death in 1777, Wright divided his property into 4 parcels intended for his sons and one son-in-law to acquire, though they were required to pay the estate to obtain actual title. This map shows the location of the plots in today's Orvilla. In September 1777, the British Army entered and occupied Philadelphia. While Washington's army wintered at Valley Forge, it was common for British loyalists, called Tories by their Patriot enemies, to participate in raids into the surrounding countryside, to seize or destroy supplies, or to kidnap or kill important patriots. According to local historian Edward Matthews, John Wright's sons became notorious Tories who were hostile to the Patriot cause and who treasonably furnished information and supplies to the British and directed British marauding expeditions. At least one of John Wright's sons participated in a February 1778 raid, the object of which was to kidnap Lieutenant Colonel Jacob Reed, the leading Patriot military figure in Hatfield Township. Reed owned substantial land in northern Hatfield Township, and his farmhouse still stands at today's 3226 Penn Street. Reed fought with distinction under Washington, was commissioned a lieutenant colonel in the militia, and was hated by the Tories. The exact involvement of the Wrights in the attack on Reed is unclear. In 1891, historian Matthews reported that it was Abijah Wright who led an attacking party to Reed's home. According to this account, Reed vigorously resisted being carried off, fought gallantly in his doorway, and drove off the enemy. Supposedly, Reed's sword broke and pierced Abijah's foot, and a trail of blood enabled Abijah to be tracked for several miles, taken prisoner, and summarily hanged from an oak tree near Montgomery Square. Other historians tell this story differently. Hatfield historian David Allebach named John Wright as leader of the attackers. In 1974, when the modernized Wright home went up for sale, its owner asserted that Jonathan and Abijah resided in the log cabin before the Revolution, and while inside it, formed a conspiracy and went up to Hatfield to do harm to Colonel Reed. The house has since become known as the Wright Conspiracy House. It seems clear that Abijah Wright was in some way involved in the Reed assault, but he was not hanged at Montgomery Square. Soon after the British evacuated Philadelphia in June 1778, Abijah was indicted for attempted burglary and treason based on an assault on a Whitman Township justice of the peace named Andrew Knox. Abijah was tried in a Philadelphia court, convicted of burglary, and sentenced to hang. He was publicly executed in December 1778, likely near where Philadelphia's City Hall now stands. The fate of Abijah's brothers is uncertain. Whether or not Jonathan or John Wright also participated in the attack on Colonel Reed, all the Orvilla property willed to them and to Abijah was confiscated by colonial officials and sold as the property of traders. Some historians have called Abijah Wright, who like his brothers was a first cousin of Daniel Boone, a desperate ruffian, one of the rabble of Hatfield. One suggested that the Wrights must have been a shiftless family because when their possessions were confiscated, all the brothers were very much in debt and some of their Orvilla lands were very poor. It seems doubtful to me that the attack on Reed was planned in and carried out from the Wright log cabin. There is no evidence that any of the Wright brothers still resided in Hatfield Township after the British occupied Philadelphia. It seems unlikely that anything the Wrights did was the result of a conspiracy of brothers, more probable that one or more of the Wrights helped guide an attack that had been planned in Philadelphia by the British. But whether or not any conspiracy was hatched inside the Wright homestead, it is certainly an historic building, once home to dedicated Tories. In 1792, Pennsylvania German John Stromkindig purchased a farm containing a log home built in 1732, located off Welsh Road, north of the Plains Mennonite Church, on the former tract of Richard Williams. Kindig's home, which has been modernized but still stands, has become known as the Williams-Kindig House. Later, several generations of Kindigs, including the settler's son John Stauffer Kindig, his grandson John Moyer Kindig, and his great-grandson Henry Kratz Kindig, all acquired lands north of today's Orvilla Road. Orvilla Road did not even exist when the first Kindigs arrived. After the road was opened in 1822 between Welsh Road and the Bethlehem Pike, it became known as the Doylestown and Trap Road because it helped link Trap on the west and Doylestown on the east. In 1864, a new farmhouse was added to the Orvilla roadside. A large plaster-over clapboard farmhouse was erected at what is now 244 West Orvilla Road by John Moyer Kindig on ancestral land. Here is another view of the property, which once was used as a dairy farm. By the 1930s, the Kindig farmhouse became Hill's Hospital, a lying-in hospital for expectant mothers owned by James and Hannah Hill. In the 1970s, the farmhouse became the John Kindig House Bed and Breakfast. Today, it is again a private residence. In 1838, a unique octagonal structure appeared at the northwest corner of today's Orvilla and Coffle Roads. On weekdays, the building served as a schoolhouse, and it became known as the Eight-Cornered Schoolhouse. On Sundays, the building was used as a meeting house and place of worship for the German Brethren, so-called Dunkards, who practiced baptism by immersion in water. Dunkard services were held in the building until 1866, when the building was razed following a typhoid epidemic. In 1871, the structure was rebuilt with a more conventional design and became a public school. For a time it was known as the Miller's Corner School because blacksmith Charles Miller operated his smithy catty-corner from the school. Later it became the Orvilla School, Hatfield, PS. No. 3. A Christmas entertainment was given at the Orvilla School in 1921. This program included recitations, dialogues, and songs by the students of the school and their families. This event represented a swan song for the public school. The next year, the new centrally located Hatfield Joint Consolidated School replaced Hatfield's one-room schoolhouses, and the Orvilla Schoolhouse became a private dwelling. This is what it looked like toward the end of the 20th century. Today it is largely hidden behind a grove of tall arborvitae trees. In 1843, Henry Stover erected, next to the octagonal schoolhouse, a farmhouse that stands today as 770 West Orvilla Road. Between 1867 and 1887, this building was the home of neighborhood blacksmith Charles Miller. In May 1930, when it was owned by Benjamin Landis, the play Happy Days, without either Richie Cunningham or the Fonz, was performed inside for neighbors for 4 cents admission. This farmhouse is the oldest residential building standing along Orvilla Road. In July 1881, Henry Hawkins, a prominent criminal defense lawyer, began acquiring local property along what was once known as the road between Hatfield and Lansdale, now as Schwab Road. A bachelor, Hawkins erected as his summer home a handsome 10-room residence on the east side of the road, which for a time afterwards was called Hawkins Road. Here are some recent views of Hawkins' house. In August 1903, Hawkins held a grand gathering at his home. A writer for the Philadelphia Inquirer reported that Hawkins' guests made merry on the spacious lawns of their gracious host, and that though the unknowing might have characterized the event as a mere picnic, the event proved to be a lawn party of the most pretentious character. Hawkins died in his Orvilla mansion 6 years later of Parkinson's disease. Following Hawkins' death, the residence was sold to a buyer who converted it into a boarding house. With the establishment of the Hatfield Joint Consolidated School in 1922, Milton Z. Popdelp began busing school children from the four corners of the township to the school building on Main Street. Delp's buses were housed on Schwab Road on a portion of the property previously owned by Hawkins. By the 1930s, the former Hawkins residence was converted to apartments and became known as the Unity House, a summer retreat for Jews. Today it enjoys life as the Deer Run Apartments. In 1883, William B. Moyer purchased a farm on the south side of Orvilla Road, just west of Schwab Road. Moyer's farm included a 3-story farmhouse with gingerbread trim and a wraparound porch. Moyer added a French-style mansard roof. The Moyer property also included a large barn just west of the farmhouse, pressing its side close to Orvilla Road. William Moyer died in February 1904. 3 months later, his property went up for sale. It was advertised as a fine place for a gentleman's country residence, surrounded with refined city people. But the farm was not sold, and William's wife Elizabeth and his son Walter continued to occupy it for many years. Walter operated a butchering business on the premises. Walter Moyer lived with his mother until her death. In 1939, at age 62, he married for the first time. By the 1950s, Walter and his wife Betty were getting on in years. Their once ornate farmhouse was visibly growing in need of care, and for a time they rented out space in their home. After Betty Moyer died in April 1965, Walter lived alone in the fading Victorian building, occupying only its first floor. Because his home did not contain indoor plumbing, Walter was obliged to use an outhouse when nature called, as it so often does for older men. The Moyer farmhouse was abandoned in 1973 and dismantled in 1975, a year before Walter Moyer's death. For many years, Coffle Road north of Orvilla was known as Elroy Road. It was renamed after the death of longtime Orvillian Jesse Coffle, whose farm can be seen on the center of this 1893 map. The former Coffle farm, which I photographed in 1958, has long vanished from the earth. German immigrant Gottlieb Schmid in 1886 acquired a 52-acre farm encompassing most of today's Coffle Road, south of Orvilla, with a farmhouse south of the Neshaminy Creek. In 1901, a new brick home was built for Schmid, but he would not long enjoy it. He died in 1904, and in 1906 his widow sold what remained of his farm to the Lehigh Valley Transit Company, which used it as a right-of-way for its trolley tracks. Over the decades following Gottlieb Schmid's death, his former property along Coffle Road was subdivided, and a number of homes were built between Oak Park Road and Orvilla Road. In this 1951 zoning map, the new development was designated as Orvilla Heights. Back in 1891, Schmid had sold William Sturzebecker, a German-born nurseryman, 6 acres on the east side of Kaufel, on which Sturzebecker built a home and a greenhouse. In 1896, he sold them to another German-born florist, Frederick Roos. Roos experienced tragedy in Orvilla. In 1905, his 14-year-old daughter May, while preparing the family's dinner, poured coal oil on a wood fire to speed the cooking. An immediate explosion resulted, and May was enveloped in flames. Her clothing was burned completely off her, and she was said to have died in the greatest agony. 4 years later, Roos left Orvilla. By 1919, Holland-born Herman Cornelis Appius acquired the greenhouse's property, and with his brother-in-law began business as the Orvilla Grove Greenhouses. For this business, Mr. Appius adopted the advertising slogan, "Straight from the plant to you." Here he is with his son Herman Jr. inside one of his greenhouses. And this was his delivery truck. Other Orvilla greenhouses were built in 1912 by George Didden, who later established greenhouses in Hatfield. In the 1920s, Didden's Orvilla greenhouses were acquired by John and George Hamilton, who formed the Orvilla Greenhouse Corporation. Their property was seized by the First National Bank of Lansdale in 1933 and sold to Edward Hilpert, who thereafter operated the Orvilla greenhouses. In 1944, Mr. Appius moved from his home at the greenhouses to the former Orvilla schoolhouse, and for many years both the Orvilla Grove greenhouses and the Orvilla greenhouses, which are shown in close propinquity on this map, hand-drawn by Herman Appius' son, were operated by Mr. Hilpert. Slightly south of the Kaufel Road greenhouses, in 1920, Harold Bonnekemper established a typesetting and printing business that would operate for over 50 years. A decade before, Mr. Bonnekemper had become the first Orvillian with electricity and indoor plumbing. In March 1929, Harold's 13-year-old son Edward Bonnekemper established a one-page local Saturday paper, which he set by hand on a linotype in his father's plant and named the Orvilla Futurist. This little paper, which achieved a circulation of approximately 200, regularly contained an editorial, news of the doings of local Orvillians, household hints, jokes, sports news, and what young Bonnekemper called advertisements of truth and merit. May 24, 1930 saw the last issue of the Futurist, but in 1951 Edward Bonnekemper became publisher of the Grad Gazette, a newsletter for graduates of Hatfield High School, and then became its editor the following year. The Gazette continues to this day to be published thanks to Larry Stevens. Also in the 1950s, Edward purchased the Hatfield Times and later published it as the Penn Valley Times. Here he is pictured with a linotypist in 1958. When America's bicentennial approached, Edward turned his talents from the future to the past, publishing an extensive update of David Allerbach's 1944 History of Hatfield. Today, the once humming printing presses of Harold and Edward Bonnekemper are silent. Work on a North Pennsylvania Railroad line connecting Philadelphia and Bethlehem began in 1853. By 1857, train travel from Philadelphia reached a point 2 miles from Bethlehem. To get there, the rail line had to pass through the fields of Hatfield Township, and its tracks crossed the Doylestown and Trap Road just east of today's Schwab Road. At the time, there was no Schwab Road, indeed no road of any name, just farmland, which in 1855 had been acquired by Frederick Schwab Sr. In February 1865, a railroad accident disturbed the peace of the nearby area. While attending school in Franconia Township, young Jacob Freed felt his schoolhouse shaken as if it was struck by an earthquake wave. The cause of this commotion was the explosion of the locomotive Cheltenham, a familiar and noble railroad engine at or near the railroad crossing where the Orvilla station would later be erected. 5 men were killed outright, 2 badly burned. In 1889, the Philadelphia and Reading established a new station, 1.7 miles from the Lansdale train station and 1 1/10 miles south of the Hatfield station, on the northern side of the Doylestown and Trapp Road. On Monday, December 1, 1890, it officially gave this station a curious name, Orvilla. Why the name Orvilla was chosen remains a mystery. The male name Orville comes from a French place name that translates as Town of Gold. Orvilla, the feminine equivalent of Orville, might conceivably have been meant to suggest a golden place. There are other, perhaps more likely explanations. Railroad stations sometimes took the names of locomotives that traveled the route on which they were located, and the name Orvilla may have been placed on an engine by a railroad official who wanted to immortalize a mother, sister, daughter, granddaughter, or sweetheart. Orvilla was a not entirely uncommon name by the 1890s, sometimes even given to men. Perhaps the name honored Orvilla Belisle, a recently deceased female author who wrote popular know-nothing novels, which sometimes attacked Mormons, sometimes Catholics. Or perhaps it honored a celebrated young acrobat named Orvilla, who in 1890 was described as the wonder of the age and the most finished equilibrist, that is, balancing artist, performing for the public. Perhaps Orvilla the equilibrist was dignified like this, or lively like this. But I recently have found reason to suspect that the acrobatic Orvilla was actually a man. So just maybe Orvilla looked like this. Then again, it's possible that the Orvilla station was named for some sweet local girl, possibly little Lizzie Orvilla Hildebrand Herzog, born in Culpsville in 1888. Or perhaps it was named for Orvilla Rosenberger, a teenager in 1890 who later married a Kindig and thereby acquired a truly Orvillian name. But I suppose we'll never know. Back in the mid-1990s, I asked Edward Bonnekemper where the name came from, and he told me that he had never thought about it. After the naming of the train station in December 1890, the roadside which it stood received its present name, and the surrounding community became known as Orvilla. It was then that the Miller's Corner School, formerly the Eight-Cornered Schoolhouse, became the Orvilla School. And the same year that the Orvilla train station was christened, a new post office at the intersection of Main and Vine Streets in Lower Hatfield, at the time when there was an Upper Hatfield and a Lower Hatfield, was opened and given the name Orvilla. The establishment of the Orvilla post office seems to have been part of a movement to rename Lower Hatfield Orvilla and to rename part of Cowpath Orvilla Avenue. In 1891, an application was made for a charter to establish the Orvilla Avenue Turnpike Company, which proposed to improve the principal streets of Lower Hatfield. But by 1893, Myers Post Office was renamed South Hatfield, and in 1898, the two Hatfield villages merged to become Hatfield Borough. The coming of the Orvilla train station connected Hatfield Township to the greater world beyond. In 1891, the Souderton Oddfellows Lodge advertised a railway excursion that would begin at Quakertown at 6:15 a.m., reach Orvilla by 6:58 a.m., then take the traveler accompanied by 7 different religious orders and congregations under the Brooklyn Bridge and 60 miles up the Hudson River to the United States Military Academy. Tickets for this round trip were only $2.75, children half price. In its first 25 years, the Little Orvilla station became the site of some curious crimes. In January 1913, 4 men were arrested and imprisoned in Norristown on a charge of having taken possession of the Reading Railway Station at Orvilla. In March 1915, Percy's Central News reported on what it called one of the most revolting stories which has ever come to the attention of the authorities in this section. This sad story concerned a 15-year-old girl named Tilly, a ward of the juvenile court on a charge of incorrigibility, and an older Lansdale woman of unsavory reputation. These 2 ladies were romantically inclined and spent 2 days and nights with Italian men in a single room in Doylestown before the men tired of them and threw them out. Then, after wandering around other nearby towns, the girls met 2 other Italian men at Orvilla and spent the night with them in the Orvilla train station. They did this again the next night, then wandered around some more until the police spotted them and arrested them. All I can say to this is, that's amore. The Orvilla Railroad crossing, quiet and peaceful as it appears today, whether approached from the east or from the west, has had a troubled past. In June 1913, Samuel Fassbenner, a young Hatfield butcher, met his death there. Fassbenner, traveling by horse cart, failed to wait for all the cars of an express train to pass before heading across the tracks. He was carried by train for 500 yards and fatally thrown against a fence. A Lansdale undertaker found that Fassbenner's body was not badly mutilated and that his pocket watch was still running, but that nearly every bone in his body had been broken. In August 1920, 74-year-old Dr. Samuel Clymer Moyer, the grand old man of the medical profession in the North Penn area at the time, headed home toward Lansdale from a rural house call. Dr. Moyer, traveling by horse and buggy, was an experienced rider and had safely crossed the Orvilla tracks many times. But this time, as he neared the crossing, he somehow remained unaware that an express train was simultaneously racing toward it. Just before impact, Dr. Moyer tried to stop his horse, but he could not avoid collision. The engine plowed into the side of the horse, throwing it 40 feet into a mile marker and killing it instantly, also destroying the buggy. Thrown from his buggy, Dr. Moyer fractured his skull and was rendered unconscious. Soon after being carried by stretcher to his Lansdale office, he breathed his last. For a time afterwards, what had been known as Schwab Road was known as Dr. Moyer's Road. Now it simply connects to Moyer Road. In September 1921, 2 brothers named Kladowski were killed when a small truck loaded with lumber which they were hauling from Philadelphia to Hatfield was demolished by a northbound express train at the unguarded Orvilla crossing. And there have been many more accidents. A near tragedy occurred at the Orvilla crossing about 15 years later on July 3, 1936. On the eve of that year's 4th of July, a 40-car freight train headed toward Bethlehem passed through Lansdale, traveling at high speed. As it reached the Orvilla crossing, the train derailed. The engine leaped over 2 feet in the air, and 19 cars in the center of the train jumped over the rails and piled up crosswise over both sides of the tracks. Thanks to the presence of alcohol, molasses, and road oil in the derailed cars, the cars burst into flames. Firemen had to work through the night to extinguish the spectacular blaze. Thousands of rubberneckers for miles around gathered to enjoy the free holiday show. One enterprising community resident erected a stand, and enjoyed a big business selling soda pop and hot dogs. Fortunately, there were no fatalities from either the derailment or the hot dogs. In 1894, an architectural gem was added to the northern side of the Orvilla roadside, just west of the Moyer residence. This turreted structure was first owned by Henry Kratz Kindig, the son of John Moyer Kindig and great-grandson of Orvilla settler John Strom Kindig. Henry, born in Orvilla in 1839, by the 1850s had left Orvilla to learn the grocery business, and he had become a prominent Philadelphia wholesale grocer, establishing a firm bearing his name. In 1889, Henry acquired the Orvilla farm previously owned by his father and began using the old farmhouse at 244 Orvilla Road as his summer residence. Then in 1894, possibly seeking a grander dwelling to befit his business stature, he purchased 24 acres north of Orvilla Road, between Coffle Road and the Philadelphia and Reading tracks, and on it he had architect Milton Bean erect a mansion in the woods. Because it was built for a summer home, it had no fireplaces. Next to it stood a carriage house, built of the same dark quarried stone as the mansion itself. Kindig died in September 1908 of a paralytic stroke suffered in his mansion. A viewing was held in that home, after which Kindig was interred far from Orvilla in Philadelphia's prestigious Mount Laurel Cemetery. In 1922, Kindig's mansion was acquired by Frank J. Werner, owner of Lansdale's Werner Foundry. In 1946, the dwelling was acquired by Harold Michener Sr., a distant cousin of Doylestown novelist James Michener. Following Michener's death in 1972, his wife and son subdivided the property, separating the mansion from the carriage house and building an addition onto the latter. A notable resident reached Orvilla in the 1890s. In May 1895, Frank Howe Jr. acquired a large property at the southwest corner of Orvilla Road and the Cowpath. In the 1850s, this property had contained a planing mill. By Howe's purchase, it contained a large Swiss barn. Howe was a minor celebrity in Philadelphia. He managed Philadelphia's Walnut Street Theater and was the partner of Henry B. Harris, a well-known theatrical man who, like the unsinkable Molly Brown, had survived the sinking of the Titanic. Howe and his wife established a country home in Orvilla, which they named Orvilla Farm, and began operating a dairy farm which featured a herd of Guernsey cows and a creamery. I suspect that this postcard shows Mrs. Howe and a friend on the farm. Orvilla Farm attracted considerable publicity. In July 1897, the Philadelphia Inquirer reported under the caption, "Frank Howe's Freak," that Howe's farm numbered among its residents a freak pig, with a single body but two heads. The bodies were joined, and each face with perfectly formed features was turned halfway around from its natural position, thus allowing the heads to be joined at the back. After this malformed pig died, it was preserved in alcohol, and Howe was visited by curiosity seekers from miles around. 2 years later, a Percy newspaper reported that Howe owned a big, ferocious, thoroughbred bull who would delight to attack a person and who had previously killed a farmer employed by Howe. It was said that pitchforks and clubs had to be carried whenever the bull was out of its stall, or somebody would get hurt. In 1900, the barn on Orvilla Farm was destroyed by fire, caused by the spontaneous combustion of hay. 3 fine-bred horses and a colt, a runabout and buggy, a carpenter shop, an ice house, and other small buildings all were destroyed, but Howe's country home was narrowly saved from destruction by neighbors and firemen. In May 1913, a furnished log cabin on house property was offered for rental. Described as primitive and picturesque and said to have been built 150 years before, it was advertised as having all the modern conveniences plus access to pure water from an artesian well. Shortly afterwards, a 10-room house with wide porches and pure water, Howe's own home, was offered for $50 per month rent. By December, the reason for these listings became clear when Howe filed for bankruptcy, reporting liabilities of over $80,000 and no assets other than his clothing, jewelry, and household effects. Howe had become heavily indebted when several shows he financed proved failures, and he lost his theater management positions. In 1914, Orvilla Farm was sold to Walter S. Nicholson. The cabin on Orvilla Farm, 2 stories tall, 28 feet square, located in the shade of an old pear tree and several apple trees, and at the end of a narrow 300-yard lane, burned to the ground in 1928. That lane would in time become Cabin Road. Throughout the 1950s and beyond, the home at the corner of Orvilla and Cowpath was occupied by Roosevelt I. Rip Polite and his wife Eleanor's family. Polite, born in Ripatone, Italy, emigrated to the United States in 1920s. By the 1950s, Polite headed the Dexter Wayne Company, whose products included Ramar of the Jungle board games and basketball equipment. In 1960, Mr. Polite began serving the Orvilla community as a Justice of the Peace. From 1972 to 1980, he served as a state senator. The home is now occupied by an equipment auction house. The turn of the 20th century saw the arrival of trolley service in Orvilla. Trolleys became highly popular because their cars were smaller, cleaner, and less noisy than train cars. They offered Orvillians transportation to the shopping districts of Lansdale, Norristown, and points beyond, including Philadelphia's Chestnut Hill. The creation of the Inland Traction Company was reportedly part of a business stratagem by the Lehigh Valley Traction Company to block the competing Quakertown Traction Company from building its own trolley line to Philadelphia. When the Inland Traction Company first established a line between Lansdale and Percy, it placed the tracks alongside the existing Philadelphia and Reading Railroad tracks part of the way, but the tracks turned west from Hatfield along Vine Street, then south along Coffle Road, then west on the south side of Orvilla Road before cutting across a field to reach Lansdale's Main Street. The OVTC later established a second trolley line, its celebrated Liberty Bell trolley route from Allentown to Philadelphia. The tracks of this line passed the Orvilla station on the west side of the railroad tracks, then curved toward the north side of Squirrel Lane, past what would become the gateway to Oak Park. From there into Lansdale Borough, and on into Wales Junction where the trains diverged, one line to Norristown, the other to Chestnut Hill. Trolleys served Orvilla faithfully for 5 decades. Ironically, just as a development of new homes was about to substantially enlarge the Orvilla community, service came to an abrupt halt. At 6:00 p.m. on September 6, 1951, without prior warning, it was announced that the trolleys would be immediately replaced with autobus service. The next day, crews began removing the tracks, which were scrapped and reused for the Korean War effort. Bus service would afterwards be provided by the North Penn Bus Company, and of course automobile traffic increased. In 1917, Russian immigrant Jacob Silverman acquired a farm on part of the old Wright Tract with a farmhouse set far back from Schwab Road, shown here on the lower right portion of this map. Jacob had immigrated to the United States in 1904 to escape Russian persecution of Jews, and he became a junk dealer, peddling wares of all kinds from a pack on his back, traveling from farm to farm. By 1917, he had not become a naturalized citizen and could neither read nor write English. In June 1922, national attention was drawn to Silverman after Lansdale game warden Jeremiah Reinert visited the Silverman farm on a tip that Jacob owned a dog. The tip was accurate. Several years before, Jake had purchased a puppy, half St. Bernard and half Mastiff. The dog, named Dick, had become huge, but was extremely gentle. Silverman admitted that he owned the dog and that he was not an American citizen. Reinert, a sergeant during the Spanish-American War, was a hard man who had angered a crowd in Lansdale by using an unlicensed puppy for target practice in the streets of the town and then killing it. Reinert was determined to enforce a Pennsylvania law which barred aliens from owning dogs, a harsh law which provided jail time or a fine for the immigrant and a death sentence for the animal. Though Silverman and his children pleaded for Dick's life, Reinert insisted that the dog had to die. The case came before local magistrate Howard Bourse, who granted a 10-day reprieve while he considered the case. Meanwhile, Dick's plight attracted national publicity. President Warren G. Harding's wife heard of Dick's troubles and brought the case to the president's attention. Harding wrote to Pennsylvania's governor, informally appealing for clemency for Dick, and the governor promised that he would, if necessary, act to save Dick's life. Before that became necessary, Magistrate Bourse decided to remit Silverman's fine and to spare Dick. He placed Dick in the care of a New Britain Township farmer under SPCA supervision. Silverman began studying English and applied to become a naturalized citizen while occasionally visiting Dick. Dick the dog rode in Lansdale's 1922 semi-centennial parade with Jake Silverman and one of his daughters on a float which proclaimed him the most famous dog in the world. In appreciation of President Harding's role in saving Dick's life, Jake Silverman named a son, born in Orvilla in October 1922, Maurice Harding Silverman. Dick finally was reunited with the Silverman family after a 3-year separation after Jake earned naturalized citizenship. Dick lived happily ever after, at least until 1930, when he was painlessly killed when too old to enjoy life. By the 1950s, Jake was a widower, and his children were no longer at home and his property was becoming dilapidated. Some local youths imagined that the old place was abandoned or haunted, and were fearful of Jacob, who still spoke less than clear English if they happened to encounter him. Jacob was still occasionally to be seen in the 1960s before disappearing from view, his fate presently unknown. In July 1965, Jacob and his daughter deeded portions of the Schwab Road farm to the Hatfield Township Municipal Authority, and in May 1971, Martha Silverman deeded land to Deltron Incorporated. In the late 1970s, when the Hatfield Volunteer Fire Company responded to a report of a small fire on the former Silverman premises, Larry Stevens found the former Silverman home largely reduced to rubble and surrounded by trees. A quarry was once centrally located in the former right tract, between Orvilla Road and Oak Park Road, and a finger of the Neshaminy Creek passed into and through it. The quarry, shown here from above in 1938, was once owned by James Haley and operated as the Haley Stone Quarry. It had ceased operations well before 1921. When the quarry was first excavated and what use was made of its stone is unknown, but it seems likely that the stone had been used for paving materials for nearby roads or roadbed materials for nearby trolley lines. In 1921, the abandoned quarry became the scene of considerable excitement. After tire tracks leading to the quarry resulted in the discovery and recovery of an automobile bearing the license tags of a vehicle stolen from a Philadelphia jeweler, fire engines from the Lansdale and Hatfield companies were called out to pump out the quarry. After 3 days of pumping lowered the water level from 43 to 16 feet, 2 automobiles were brought to the surface by grappling equipment. Police and county detectives concluded that the quarry had been used by motor vehicle thieves as a graveyard for cars they could not sell. Shortly after the second automobile was recovered, grappling equipment struck a hard object believed to be a third auto, and the dragging work was continued. It was said that after still more water was pumped, even more cars and a motorcycle, which had been reported stolen and already paid for by insurance, were found in its depths. It was also said that a steam shovel was found rusting at the quarry's bottom. Then in March 1922, a local jitney driver named George Burge disappeared, failing to appear for a planned late-night meeting at a pond near Souderton. Burge's driver's cap was found floating on the pond's surface, and within days his car was dragged from its waters, its license tags missing and its engine numbers scratched off. Authorities found a billhead containing Burge's name in a side pocket of another vehicle recently dragged from the Orvilla quarry, suggesting that Burge was connected to earlier criminality. An accomplice of Burge's eventually confessed that Burge had planned to junk his car in the Souderton pond and then to claim the insurance proceeds. However, while pushing his vehicle into the water, Burge slipped and drowned. Finally, in November 1924, a 21-year-old man from Philadelphia was arrested after dumping another stolen auto into the Orvilla quarry's waters. He confessed to transporting a stolen automobile to the quarry and sinking it there, and disclosed the existence of a stolen car ring operating out of Philadelphia. During the 1960s, Nicecrete Corporation's cement trucks could be seen driving to the Orvilla quarry at the end of their working days, using an entrance off Oak Park Road and dumping the contents of their hoppers, gradually helping to fill the old quarry. Eventually, the quarry was filled in by Nicecrete and/or by real estate developers. In any case, by the late 1990s and early 2000s, the formerly wooded area between Orvilla Road and Oak Park Road saw the erection of many new homes. The establishment of grocery stores in Orvilla involved a kind of game of musical chairs, as illustrated by this map drawn by Herman Ophius Jr. By the mid-1920s, an Orvillian named James Dunkel established an ice cream stand in the front of his home at today's 750 Orvilla Road. In 1927, Clarence Klein and his wife bought Dunkel's stand and moved it to their front yard at 740 Orvilla Road. In 1929, the Kleins changed their line of business from ice cream to groceries, obtained a Unity Frankfurt grocery stores franchise, and began operating Klein's grocery store in the front room of their house. In 1935, widow Jenny Smith purchased from Bernard Vincent a large property at what is now 706 West Orvilla, containing a 1900 farmhouse built on lands once owned by Anthony Morris, the second mayor of Philadelphia. Mrs. Smith also purchased the Klein's grocery franchise and established a store in the front room of her home, which she operated as Smith's Grocery Store and Delicatessen. In October 1937, Mrs. Smith transferred the Unity Frankfurt franchise and a 33 by 144-foot plot of ground, formerly the site of a chicken coop, to her neighbors Martin and Viola Fisher. The Fishers owned a house next door at 724 Orvilla, one that had been built by Mr. Vincent in 1928. On the newly transferred lot next to his house, Martin Fisher erected a wood-framed, asbestos-shingled Unity Frankfurt grocery store. The Fishers operated their grocery store for nearly 8 years, then in June 1945 sold both their home and grocery store to my parents David and Dorothy Lewis, who operated it as Lewis's Unity Frankfurt store, or simply Lewis's store. This image shows them on the store steps with my brother David, circa 1946. Here is my grandmother Lily in front of the store about 1947. And here I make a Christmas time appearance with my brother. And here is an image which I captured during the winter of 1957 of a new store sign and a snowy stretch of Orvilla Road. Our store operated until 1958 or 1959, when it succumbed to the growth of new supermarkets, in particular the Acme Market at Oak Park. My father died in 1963, my mother in 1967, and both the house and the vacant grocery store were sold in July 1967. Within a month, the new owner sold the lot on which the store stood to the owner of 706 Orvilla, who promptly had the store building demolished. The house itself was eventually demolished in February of 2003. Afterwards, a new home with the same street address was built well back from Orvilla Road. Lewis's Grocery was, of course, not the only Orvilla grocery store. By the 1950s, Eli Clemmer Krupp, a former truck driver for a pretzel company, operated a Montco grocery store by his home at 1319 Schwab Road. For many years, a colorful 7-Up sign at the corner of Schwab and Orvilla marked the way to Krupp's. Krupp's Market outlasted Lewis's store and continued to do business well into the 1960s. It is now shuttered. As we have seen, many changes to Orvilla were gradual. One dramatic post-war change occurred in the mid-1950s with the arrival of a new housing development. Situated on a northerly portion of the former Henry K. Kindig property, this development, designated on some zoning maps as Orvilla Park, was bounded on the west by Coffle Road and on the east by the new Werner Road. At the same time, much more development was on the minds of local planners. The 1950 and 1951 zoning maps of Hatfield Township showed areas designated as Clearview Heights at Lansdale Square, with numerous proposed intersecting streets. Much as Hatfield Township has changed, these projects never came to pass. One newspaper headline toward the close of the 1950s showed how much Orvilla was changing. On September 9, 1959, the Penn Valley Times reported that the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania had approved installation of a traffic light at the intersection of Orvilla and Welsh Roads, something previously denied on the grounds of insufficient traffic. Today, of course, that once little trafficked intersection is about to be widened at the cost of about $3 million. Another large change occurred by 1967, the year my family home was sold and I sadly had to leave Orvilla behind. Subdivision number 1 appeared on the township zoning map. Since then, many new residences along West, Sourwood, Leon, and Grapevine Drives have been built on former farmland and have become permanent parts of the once agricultural Orvilla landscape. Finally, our tour again crosses the Orvilla railroad tracks, where no train or trolley stations are now to be seen. We began tonight's exploration at a cemetery, and it seems fitting to end at one. In 1854, an evangelical church was built at today's 1133 West Orvilla Road, near where railroad tracks would later appear. The original church building has been replaced by one with a date stone reading Orvilla Chapel, 1867-1954. For years, the building was home to the Orvilla Seventh-day Adventist Church. Both the church and the adjoining Orvilla Cemetery have passed through many hands in nearly 175 years. Though the congregation that first established it is long gone, the cemetery remains well cared for today. Within its quiet and peaceful grounds rest the spirits of many once prominent Orvilla residents who have witnessed many changes in Orvilla and perhaps dream happily of its simple and pleasant past. And now, as the sun sinks slowly into the west, we end our tour and bid a fond farewell to charming Orvilla, Pennsylvania. Thank you all for joining me on this journey into the past.
All right, thank you so much, Don, for that very interesting and informative presentation. Don's book, Orvilla, My Orvilla, is available while supplies last for $25, and you can order your copy by contacting the Society by phone or email. Thank you again, Don, for the great program, and thank you all for watching.